There's a unique kind of heartbreak that follows those who were once called gifted. As children, they were praised, spotlighted, and held up as symbols of promise, those destined to achieve great things. Their intelligence wasn't just seen as a skill, it became their identity. Every gold star, every compliment, every proud look from a teacher or parent quietly reinforced a dangerous belief. You are only as valuable as your potential. But what happens when the applause fades? When life becomes less about impressing and more about surviving? For many, the brilliance that once defined them now feels like a distant myth, replaced by self-doubt, chronic frustration, and an invisible pressure to live up to a future that never came. The disconnect between who they were told they'd become and who they are now is not just disappointing, it's disorienting. It feels like a fall from grace that no one saw, a silent collapse behind a smiling face. The world rarely notices when the gifted unravel. They just quietly disappear from the spotlight. And for the person behind the gifted label, that disappearance feels like failure. But it's not just about unmet potential. It's about the weight of unrealistic expectations. The child was promised that talent would lead to success, admiration, and meaning. But adulthood reveals a harsher truth. The world doesn't reward depth, it rewards utility. This realization is devastating because it not only challenges their external achievements, but shakes the foundation of who they believed they were. The collapse of brilliance is not just a career detour, it's an identity crisis. And the grief that follows isn't just for what was lost, but for the version of themselves they can no longer find. As gifted children grow into adulthood, many confront a bitter truth that no one warned them about. The world doesn't reward brilliance, it rewards functionality. In childhood, being intelligent meant being praised for seeing what others couldn't, for learning faster, thinking deeper, and dreaming bigger. But in the adult world, those same traits often go unnoticed, or worse, become liabilities. Employers don't care how philosophical you are. They care how fast you can complete a task. Society doesn't applaud introspection. It prizes productivity. Intelligence without actionable application is seen as impractical. And in a culture that prioritizes results over reflection, many gifted individuals feel like they're slowly suffocating under the weight of their own awareness. They can see the flaws in the system, the contradictions in human behavior, the emptiness in superficial pursuits, but that very clarity makes them slower to conform, less willing to perform, and more vulnerable to emotional exhaustion. The world is fast, shallow, and ruthlessly indifferent to depth. It doesn't want thinkers, it wants doers. It doesn't want meaning, it wants efficiency. And in this brutal mismatch, the once bright child finds themselves lost in a world that was never designed for them. They were trained to ask big questions, to seek truth, to create beauty, but now they are told to hit deadlines, meet quotas, and not overthink things. The disconnect is not just professional, it's existential. How can someone who sees so much be expected to function like someone who never asked why? The gifted adult often finds themselves torn between the inner need to live authentically and the external demand to survive. And that tension becomes a quiet form of suffering. It's not that they are lazy or incapable, it's that they are out of place in a world that fears what it cannot measure. When society devalues depth, the gifted are not just underappreciated, they are profoundly misunderstood. And this misunderstanding can make even the most brilliant soul feel invisible. Arthur Schopenhauer once wrote, "The greater the intelligence, the deeper the pain." It's a phrase that resonates like a quiet truth to those who live in the shadows of their own brilliant minds. For the gifted, intelligence is rarely just a tool. It becomes a lens through which they see the world more vividly, more honestly, and often more painfully. While others move through life with comfortable illusions, beliefs in fairness, purpose, or guaranteed reward, the gifted often see too clearly. They notice the contradictions in people's behavior, the futility of endless ambition, and the hollowness beneath the shiny promises of modern life. And with this clarity comes a quiet torment. Because the truth, as Schopenhauer insisted, is not comforting. It's sharp, cold, and indifferent to human hope. The more you perceive, the harder it becomes to play along. For many gifted individuals, this awareness doesn't bring peace, it brings paralysis. They don't simply react to life, They analyze it, question it, dismantle it in their minds until every decision feels heavy with meaning, risk, and consequence. While others move forward on instinct, they freeze, overthinking, doubting, spiraling. And in this overactive mental space, action becomes difficult. It's not a lack of will, it's an excess of vision. They see all the ways it could go wrong. They feel the pressure of doing something meaningful, and that pressure becomes a weight they carry in silence. What others call laziness is often deep existential fatigue, the exhaustion of living in a world that feels too shallow for their depth. Schopenhauer believed that the more conscious a person becomes, the more likely they are to suffer. Not because they are flawed, but because they are awake. This idea shatters the romantic illusion of intelligence as a gift. In reality, it is often a burden, one that isolates, overwhelms, and alienates. And for the gifted adult, the pain doesn't stem from failure. It stems from lucidity, from seeing the gap between what life could be and what it really is. From realizing that the very mind that once earned admiration now traps them in endless analysis and quiet despair. In the eyes of Schopenhauer, this is not weakness. It is the tragic price of consciousness. From an early age, gifted children are not simply celebrated, they are labeled. They are told they are special, destined for greatness, born to lead or create or solve what others cannot. At first, this seems like a blessing. Praise rains down. Every accomplishment is elevated. Adults light up at every clever remark. But beneath the compliments lies an invisible contract, one that the child doesn't fully understand, but quickly internalizes. You are valuable only when you are exceptional. And that idea begins to seep into the very structure of their self-worth. Being bright becomes more than a trait. It becomes an identity. And with identity comes pressure. With every achievement, the bar rises. With every accolade, the fear of slipping grows stronger. What began as joy turns into obligation. This is the curse of expectation. The gifted child does not grow up free. They grow up haunted by the need to constantly perform. Their worth becomes tied to output, and failure isn't just failure, it's identity collapse. They don't simply fear falling short. They fear becoming nothing at all if they ever do. This pressure breeds perfectionism, procrastination, and self-sabotage. Projects go unfinished not because they don't care, but because they care too much. Every idea must be flawless. Every move must be worthy of the myth that was built around them. They hesitate not out of apathy, but out of fear. What if I'm not as brilliant as they thought I was? No one teaches the gifted how to be ordinary. No one tells them it's okay to rest, to be unsure, to fail and still be enough. And so, they grow up emotionally unprepared for adulthood. The messy, nonlinear, deeply human experience of trying and erring, learning and stumbling. When reality doesn't match the expectations they were fed, they begin to collapse internally. They stop showing up. They hide their talent out of shame. They avoid old mentors, family members, or classmates, not because they're bitter, but because they feel they've let everyone down. This quiet suffering is often invisible. On the outside, they may appear fine, but inside, they're carrying the unbearable weight of a story they can no longer live up to. The curse of expectation is that it never allows for simply being, only becoming. And when becoming falters, the soul begins to fracture. The gifted adult isn't mourning lost success. They're mourning a version of themselves they were never allowed to outgrow. At some point in adulthood, the gifted individual comes face to face with an unbearable silence. The applause has stopped. The compliments that once defined them have faded, and the pressure to keep being exceptional turns inward, mutating into something darker, more corrosive. They may still be intelligent, still perceptive, still capable of greatness, but now they are also tired. Not tired in the physical sense, but soul-weary. They look around and realize that the world they were prepared for, the one where talent opens doors and brilliance earns belonging, simply does not exist. And it is in this moment, often quiet and unspoken, that the internal collapse begins. What once felt like identity now feels like a mask. The title of gifted becomes hollow, even mocking, when success doesn't follow. The gap between who they were told they would be and who they actually are becomes a source of daily pain. And unlike childhood disappointments, This isn't about one bad grade or missed opportunity. This is about the slow, agonizing realization that their entire sense of self was built on something that no longer sustains them. They were taught to believe that talent would be enough. But now, surrounded by peers who were never called genius, yet seemed to thrive, the gifted adult begins to feel like an outsider in their own life. This collapse is not loud. It doesn't announce itself. It shows up in subtle but devastating ways: chronic procrastination, fear of starting, fear of finishing, emotional detachment, low-level depression masked as just being tired. They drift, not because they lack direction, but because every direction feels like a test they might fail. There's a constant, haunting sense of not living the life they were supposed to, and even worse, of having no idea how to fix it. Shame sets in, not for failing society, but for failing the idealized version of themselves. Every day becomes a silent performance of, "I'm fine," while inside they are mourning the death of a promise they didn't even make, but one they were expected to fulfill. The collapse isn't just intellectual, it's existential. It calls into question the very purpose of their existence. If intelligence doesn't guarantee meaning, if depth doesn't grant reward, then what remains? For someone who built their identity on being different, the idea of becoming just another adult trying to survive feels like failure in its purest form. But this too is a lie, the same lie that made them believe they had to be extraordinary to be worthy of love, peace, or purpose. And until they confront that lie, the collapse will continue, quietly dismantling the self from within. The gifted adult doesn't just fall behind, they fall into themselves, and often they don't know how to climb back out. One of the most painful realizations for gifted individuals is not just that the world doesn't understand them, it's that it doesn't even want to. Society does not reject brilliance because it lacks value. It rejects brilliance because it causes discomfort. A gifted mind is not just intelligent, it is observant, piercing, and unafraid to question what others accept. It sees the contradictions in culture, the performative nature of relationships, the shallowness of most social values. And in doing so, it unintentionally threatens the collective illusion that keeps people comfortable. The gifted person doesn't need to speak to make others feel uneasy. Their very presence, their quiet intensity, their refusal to conform acts like a mirror. And most people are not ready to see their own reflection. This is why so many gifted adults feel invisible, not because they have nothing to offer, but because what they offer is inconvenient. Depth is hard to monetize. Intellectual honesty is not a trend. Deep thinking does not go viral. In a society that values speed over substance and obedience over insight, the gifted are not celebrated. They are sidelined. The child who was once praised for their curiosity becomes the adult who is labeled too intense, too sensitive, or too much. Their insights, once adorable in a child, become threatening in an adult. And so, over time, they learn to hide themselves, to edit their words, to shrink their presence, not out of fear, but out of exhaustion. Arthur Schopenhauer wrote that the more conscious a person becomes, the more isolated they feel. This is not because they lack social skills, but because they see the world more clearly than it sees itself. And when you live in a culture that prizes surface over substance, seeing too clearly is treated as a flaw. This social rejection is subtle but deeply wounding. It sends the message, your depth is not welcome here. And for those who built their identity around being seen, being used, being admired, this rejection cuts deeper than any failure. It's not just the loss of opportunity, it's the erasure of significance. They're not forgotten, they're deliberately ignored. When the world stops clapping, a haunting question begins to echo in the minds of many once gifted individuals. Who am I without the applause? For so long, identity was fused with recognition. Their value wasn't something they developed internally. It was reflected back to them through awards, admiration, and expectations. They weren't simply a person, they were a projection, a symbol of potential, a story that other people loved to tell. But over time, the story fades. The compliments dry up. The observers move on. And what's left is not just silence, it's identity collapse. This is the tragedy that most gifted adults never speak aloud. They are not only grappling with the absence of success, but with the loss of self. They were taught to chase excellence, to stand out, to be extraordinary. And for a time, that pursuit gave them meaning. But adulthood doesn't operate on the same rules. The world no longer hands out trophies for potential. It doesn't reward insight unless it's profitable. No one is watching anymore. And for those whose sense of self was built on being seen, this becomes an existential crisis. They begin to feel like ghosts in their own lives, present but hollow, capable but unmotivated. They avoid reunions, family gatherings, old mentors, not because they are ashamed of failure, but because they no longer know who they are. The version of themselves that others once applauded no longer exists. But no one ever taught them how to be anything else. No one taught them how to value themselves outside of achievement. And now, without a stage to stand on, they feel like they've disappeared. This invisibility is not just social, it's internal. The inner voice that once said, "You're going places," is now quiet, or worse, cruel. It whispers, "You wasted it," and they start to believe it. They scroll through social media and see former classmates with stable jobs, families, houses, people who were never the smartest in the room and some, but who now seem to be thriving. Comparison sharpens the wound. The question returns. Was it all a lie? Did the brilliance they were praised for ever really matter? Or was it just a childhood myth they were foolish enough to believe? But the pain doesn't just come from the loss of external validation. It comes from the fact that they were never given tools to build internal worth. When you grow up defined by others' expectations, you rarely learn how to define yourself. You become a vessel for admiration, not authenticity. And when the admiration fades, the vessel feels empty. Schopenhauer wrote that people are often happiest when they are least self-aware. But for the gifted, self-awareness is constant. They can't turn it off. They see their own decline, their own stagnation, their own emotional implosion in real time. And that kind of awareness, without direction, without purpose, is unbearable. Yet within this crisis lies a hidden invitation. The loss of identity is not always destruction. Sometimes it is the clearing of old illusions. When the applause ends, what remains is the chance to ask, perhaps for the first time, who am I if I no longer need to impress anyone? And while the question hurts, it is also the beginning of healing. Because true identity is not built on recognition. It's built on self-understanding. And from that understanding, a new life can begin, not as a prodigy, not as a disappointment, but as someone finally free to be real. There comes a moment, quiet, often unnoticed, when the pain becomes too familiar to ignore. Not dramatic, not explosive, but heavy. A weight you carry every day, without knowing where it begins or ends. For the once gifted adult, this moment marks the turning point. After years of chasing expectations, comparing themselves to an imagined ideal, and mourning the brilliance that once lit their path, something shifts. It's not a miracle. It's not sudden healing. It's a realization. This pain isn't failure. It's clarity. Schopenhauer argued that life is suffering, not as punishment, but as a condition of consciousness. The more aware you become, the more you see the illusions that society thrives on. The chase for recognition, the obsession with success, the lie that achievement equals fulfillment. And for gifted individuals, this clarity hits hard. They were raised to believe that talent was their golden ticket, that intelligence would unlock doors and earn them love, purpose, and identity. But adulthood shattered that myth, and the aftermath left them hollow. Yet within that hollowness lies a hidden truth. The only way out is not to become brilliant again, but to become honest. To stop trying to resurrect the prodigy and instead meet the adult they've become, with all their doubts, contradictions, and emotional bruises. This is the beginning of real transformation. It's not about reclaiming a title. It's about reclaiming agency. The pain becomes a signal, not of defeat, but of awakening. You begin to see that the world's refusal to validate your depth was never about your lack of worth. It was about its lack of capacity to hold it. And so the turning point begins quietly. You stop asking, why doesn't the world see me? And start asking, why do I keep needing it to? You realize that much of your suffering wasn't caused by your limitations, but by the belief that you had to constantly prove your value. that you had to justify your existence through genius. And when that belief starts to unravel, so does the pressure. Suddenly it's okay to rest, to not be impressive, to be here, alive, uncertain, and still enough. This doesn't mean the pain disappears, but it changes shape. It becomes less of a wound and more of a doorway. Instead of resisting it, you begin to listen. Instead of numbing it with distractions or self-criticism, you let it speak. And it tells you something radical. You were never meant to be extraordinary. You were meant to be whole. From this place, clarity starts to emerge. Not clarity about career or goals or timelines, but clarity about what truly matters. You stop chasing distant ideals and start cultivating presence. You start paying attention to your inner landscape, to what feels real, not performative. And for the first time in a long time, you begin to build a sense of self that isn't built on applause, but on alignment. This is the rebirth the gifted adult rarely expects. Not a return to childhood brilliance, but the slow, sacred construction of authenticity. It's the freedom to redefine success, not as visibility, but as peace, not as perfection, but as presence. The shift is subtle, but powerful. You stop being haunted by who you were supposed to become and start becoming someone who is finally free to feel, to question, to exist without explanation. And that is the gift hidden in the collapse. The same awareness that once paralyzed you can become the foundation of a deeper, wiser life. One not shaped by expectation, but by truth. One not driven by fear, but by choice. This is the real turning point. Not the end of brilliance, but the beginning of consciousness. And from here, everything can begin again. In a society obsessed with comfort, success, and positive thinking, the idea of embracing suffering sounds almost blasphemous. But for those who have seen through the illusions of surface-level living, especially gifted individuals, who have always carried a heightened sensitivity to the world around them, there comes a time when denial no longer works. The pain can no longer be silenced by distractions, achievements, or hollow affirmations. It demands attention. And here at the intersection of exhaustion and lucidity, Schopenhauer's philosophy offers an unexpected kind of liberation. He wrote that suffering is not an anomaly to be avoided. It is the very texture of existence. And while this truth is uncomfortable, it holds within it the seed of clarity. Gifted individuals often reach this point not through tragedy, but through quiet implosion. Life did not collapse around them. It collapsed within. The dreams they were sold of purpose, admiration, and reward for their talents never fully materialized. And what's worse, no one ever taught them how to endure meaningfully when brilliance alone is not enough. But this suffering, as disorienting as it is, isn't meaningless. It is, in fact, the portal to something deeper. When the need to impress, to outperform, to fulfill a prophecy finally breaks down, it leaves behind something raw and honest, the truth of who you really are beneath the performance. Conscious suffering is not about self-pity. It is not passive despair. It is the deliberate act of facing your internal pain without numbing it or running from it. It is choosing to sit with your sadness, your disappointment, your confusion, and asking, what is this pain trying to teach me? In that question lies a radical power. Because once you stop trying to escape your suffering, you begin to transform it. It ceases to be a monster and becomes a mentor. And for gifted adults, this process can feel like unlearning a lifetime of conditioning. From childhood, they were taught to measure themselves by external milestones, grades, praise, output. But now, stripped of those metrics, they must learn to sit in the discomfort of not knowing, of not being the best, of being human. This reorientation doesn't erase the pain, but it reshapes its meaning. You begin to see that the pain you carry is not a defect. It is evidence of your depth. It is the price of seeing clearly in a world that thrives on distraction. Schopenhauer did not offer easy answers. He believed life was inherently painful because the human will is insatiable, always reaching, always longing, never content. But he also believed that through awareness and detachment, one could begin to transcend the suffering, not by eliminating it, but by no longer being enslaved to it. This is the power of conscious suffering. It doesn't promise relief, it promises understanding. And in that understanding, a new kind of peace is born. A quiet, sober strength that doesn't need applause or proof. For the gifted adult who feels invisible, broken, or misaligned, this path is not glamorous, but it is real. It is the slow return to authenticity, to building a life not rooted in performance, but in presence. Suffering may always be part of the equation, but when faced with courage and clarity, it becomes a guide. And in a world that demands speed and noise, this kind of stillness is revolutionary. It says, I will not run from my pain. I will walk through it, and in doing so, I will find myself. When all the illusions fall away, the titles, the praise, the dreams of being someone extraordinary, what remains? For the once gifted adult, that question hits like a thunderclap. The world once treated them like a project, a prototype of greatness waiting to unfold. Their identity was crafted not from within, but through years of external validation. Gold stars, awards, acceptance letters, proud teachers, impressed relatives. They weren't raised to be people. They were raised to be promises. But the truth is brutal. The world never cared about who they were. It only cared about what they could produce. And when the performance slowed, when the brilliance dimmed, so did the attention. That's when the devastating realization arrives. I wasn't loved. I was used. It is in this moment that many gifted adults fall into despair. But this moment, painful as it is also the beginning of something sacred. Liberation. Because once you realize you are no longer required to live up to anyone's myth about you, you begin to discover who you truly are. Beneath the pressure to succeed, beneath the need to prove, there exists a quieter truth. You are not a product. You are a survivor. A survivor of cultural expectations, of identity built on productivity, of a childhood where love was often conditional on achievement. And surviving that, emotionally, psychologically, is no small feat. In American culture, where worth is tied to hustle, visibility, and success, this shift feels radical. We are taught to believe our value lies in what we do, what we build, what we earn, what we contribute. But what happens when what you do no longer matches the story others told about you? What happens when your inner world becomes too rich, too complex, to be reduced to job titles or metrics? The answer is not collapse, it's rebirth. You begin to understand that your value was never meant to be measured. It was meant to be felt in your resilience, your reflection, your refusal to be reduced. You survived the mythology of being the gifted one, and now you are faced with the quieter, more meaningful task of becoming whole. This doesn't mean abandoning ambition or talent. It means no longer using them as the currency of your self-worth. You stop performing and start being. You stop chasing the narrative and begin living the truth. The pain doesn't fully vanish, but it transforms. It no longer screams, you failed. Instead, it whispers, you're free now. Schopenhauer warned that the more conscious we become, the more we suffer. But he also suggested that within that suffering lies the path to transcendence, not through denial, but through radical acceptance. The gifted adult who was once drowning in pressure now stands at a threshold. Continue playing the role or step into authenticity. And authenticity means this: I no longer exist to fulfill anyone's vision of me. Not my parents, not my teachers, not even my younger selves. I exist to live fully and honestly on my own terms. This is not weakness, it is power. Not the power to impress, but the power to endure. Not the power to dazzle, but the power to live with depth, presence, and peace. You don't need to shine, you need to be seen, for real. And even if the world never claps again, your existence has value beyond performance. You are not the failed version of someone else's prophecy. You are the living proof that it is possible to outgrow an identity, to lose everything you were told you had to be, and still emerge, wounded but awake, scarred but sovereign, not extraordinary, but finally beautifully whole. If there is one lesson to take from the emotional and philosophical journey of the once gifted adult, it's this: your worth is not something you have to earn, it is something you reclaim. For too long, many people have tied their identity to performance, to the need to be exceptional, to fulfill the story others told about them. But eventually, life confronts you with the uncomfortable truth. Brilliance alone won't save you. Praise won't sustain you, and the world won't always recognize your depth. That's not your fault. It's a flaw in how society values people. But that pain, that disillusionment, is not the end. It's the invitation. It's the moment you stop living to impress and start living to connect. First with yourself, then with the world around you. You begin to shed the layers of identity built around validation and start asking real questions. What do I feel? What do I need? What do I truly value? That's where healing begins. The most important advice is this: stop negotiating your value. You don't need to prove your intelligence. You don't need to be extraordinary to be enough. Let go of the myth that you must justify your existence through constant output. Instead, focus on building a life anchored in clarity, not applause, in presence, not perfection. This means learning to rest without guilt, to fail without shame, and to exist without explanation. You are not broken because you no longer shine the way you used to. You are evolving. You are transitioning from a life of expectation to a life of authenticity. That shift is difficult, but it's also where freedom begins. So pause, breathe, and remember. You were never meant to be a product. You were meant to be whole, and that is more than enough.